The Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce serves the interest of its members through numerous programs, advocates for a free and open market economy in Afghanistan, and endeavors to strengthen U.S.-Afghanistan economic relations. AACC's annual U.S.-Afghanistan Business Matchmaking Conference is the world's leading event for promotion of the private sector, business matchmaking, and investment in Afghanistan. AACC works to ensure that Afghanistan's economy and employment of the Afghan people remains a top priority for the U.S. and Afghan policymakers, and serves as a link between business and government to encourage progressive economic policies that will result in increased business, job creation, and investment between the U.S. and Afghanistan. We believe that peace and stability can only be achieved in Afghanistan through the success and growth of the private sector. It is the goal of AACC to promote the exchange of information and provide resources to its members through investment conferences, seminars, networking events, publications, and other avenues to stimulate U.S.-Afghanistan business and investment. The Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce, facilitating U.S.-Afghan business, investment, and trade ties.
Thank you for being here. We're about to kick off our next panel, which is called Forging a New U.S.-Afghanistan Investment Marketplace. I'm the moderator for this panel. My name is Dan Tickfart. I am Deputy Director in the Office of Afghanistan Affairs in the Bureau of South Central Asia at the U.S. Department of State. And unfortunately, on the schedule you see Deputy Assistant Secretary Henry Ensher couldn't be here, so I'm the substitute for that. I'll start off by providing a brief update on the U.S. strategy approach to the general economic policy topic for Afghanistan. But before I do that, let me introduce Mr. Enyat Qasimi of Whitford, Taylor, and Preston, who will give remarks regarding doing business in Afghanistan and how you comply with some of the governmental rules and restrictions and other considerations. Next to him is Mr. Naeem Hasanyar, who is with the Emerging Consulting Group. Mr. Hasanyar will spend some time discussing how to navigate the Afghanistan tax and reporting environment as an investor. So I think that's a very relevant topic given the climate in Afghanistan. And I don't think that Mr. Strittmeyer will be able to join us as was mentioned a few minutes ago. So let me begin by opening. As I said, I currently work in the Office of Afghanistan Affairs at the State Department. And I'm sure you're probably aware that back in August, President Trump announced a new strategy for the South Asia region. I think this has proven to be a very valuable strategy, not only for laying out our goals for Afghanistan, but also in general for the South Asian region. I think it's useful to maybe talk about the overall regional approach first and then narrow down to how we discuss implications for economic policy in Afghanistan. The policy is different from its predecessors in that it emphasizes a regional approach. It recognizes that other countries in the region will have to have collective agreement and have a collective interest in Afghanistan's success, both politically and economically. And there are many regional groupings that have been underway beforehand or are getting started in the interim period from August that are helping tie the regional support more closely together. A fundamental part of the regional approach is also more emphasis on India's support for Afghanistan's economic success, and also encouraging Pakistan to do more on cross-border trade and other initiatives with Afghanistan. I think another important feature of this new strategy to emphasize is that there is a real emphasis on not wanting to get engaged in nation building. And I think the President made that clear in his speech. Donors and the United States should not be doing the rebuilding of Afghanistan for Afghanistan. Afghanistan really owns this responsibility and has been actively engaged in taking that on. So this part of the strategy is very important. Another important aspect of the strategy is that, maybe focusing it down onto the Afghanistan specific level, is that if we're going to achieve our primary goal in Afghanistan of working with Afghanistan to make sure it's not a base for safe havening terrorist groups as it had been in the past, is to help the Afghan government stabilize itself and the country. One important way to do that is through the elections process. I'm sure, as you know, Afghanistan has scheduled parliamentary elections in October this year, followed by the very important next presidential elections in next spring in April of 2019. So it's critical for the United States and for our allies and partners that we try to support this process as much as possible. We want to make sure that the government of national unity is strongest when it's able to give voice to all Afghans. We see this process underway now in the opening of voter registration centers, trying to get people to get out, register, and be prepared to vote, and helping them realize that that's a very important duty they have in order to improve Afghanistan overall. And also, if you're going to have credibility for the elections, you need people to get out and show that they're willing to vote. So I think that is probably a good start. Another important aspect of our strategy is we want Afghanistan to pursue its peace process. So we support Afghanistan's efforts to talk to all parties. The way forward is for Afghanistan to be able to enter a negotiating process, bring other parties to the table, and having a negotiated end to the conflict is the way, and to bring these parties into the fold so that they're working with Afghanistan in a peaceful way. And President Ghani has made that very clear in his the Kabul Process Conference and other key meetings that have happened recently to encourage that. I think in terms of specific U.S. goals, some of our more important areas of emphasis is we want to encourage Afghanistan to increase access to credit. We want them to improve regional and international market access. And we want to promote legal and regulatory reforms. And we work actively with the government of Afghanistan on that every day to try to do that. I think it's important to facilitate public and private partnerships, both domestically but also regionally. So we see that more and more. For example, USAID, as you may have heard, is working to help Afghan products gain access to markets in India, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. I think it's also worth mentioning that the donor support is still there. We had a International Donors Conference for Development Assistance in Brussels in 2016, so those commitments are there. But of course, it's important for Afghanistan to continue to prove its international trade, and it's been working hard on this through agreements like with Uzbekistan in December of 2017, the Lapis Lazuli Corridor Agreement from November of last year, which facilitates trade with Europe, the Uzbek Transit Agreement, which creates links to Kazakhstan, where it also has a transit agreement that's a few years old now, and this is expanding access to markets in places like Russia and China. The United States also is assisting Afghanistan's efforts to become a normal member of the World Trade Organization. I think it's also worth emphasizing again with India that, interestingly, India has now supplanted Pakistan as Afghanistan's top export partner. Air corridor routes have opened up with India that weren't there before. And then it's worth mentioning also, last September, USAID sponsored the Passage to Prosperity Trade and Investment Show in New Delhi, which attracted a lot of Afghan and Indian businesses, created those ties, and USAID is looking to sponsor another trade and investment show in Mumbai later this year. So that's a quick overview of what we're trying to do, specifically to promote international trade with Afghanistan and other countries. And then quickly I'll mention that we're looking forward to the Geneva Donor Conference in November, which is another opportunity to see if donors are willing to continue to support Afghanistan's economic development. And we hope that that will further the goals of the U.S. South Asia strategy overall. And we can talk about that more in detail during the question and answer session. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you and see if we can go from there.
Thank you, Dan. Let me get up here. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. We have the American contingent there and the Afghan contingent here, and then some people making deals in the back. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. So if you're ever organizing a conference, it's important to have a part that deals with legal issues, but make sure that that part is at the very end of the second day or last day of the conference, because if you put it on the first day, everybody will run away. So, but if you put it in the last day, people will probably stay and not too many people will pay attention. In any event, my name is Inayat Qasmi and I'm an attorney with Whiteford, Taylor & Preston. I have a PowerPoint presentation here. My bio is attached to the documents that were given out. I am not the consul, so you should not ask me for a visa, even though it says so on there. I'm the counsel to the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce. Before I begin, a couple of sort of disclaimers as an attorney. The content of this presentation is not intended to be legal advice and it should not be relied upon as legal advice. The presentations that were given last couple of days were very, very interesting, and it gives you a glimpse of the potential for opportunities in Afghanistan. I was in particular impressed by some of the presentations in the prior panel, because they actually focused on deal aspects and how to do deals. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about legal issues, but more from a deal perspective than from a general perspective. Just broadly speaking, over the last 10, 12 years that I've been practicing law continuously, I've done deals as a deal lawyer. I've done deals throughout the emerging markets. I've done deals in Africa, in Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and of course also in the US and in developed countries. And I have to say that the risks associated with doing deals in Afghanistan and the challenges of doing deals in Afghanistan is no different from those in most of the frontier markets, which is Afghanistan is part of those frontier markets. So those are sort of similar to the issues that you deal with when you're investing in Africa or you're investing in the Middle East. So this presentation is intended for people who are investing in Afghanistan, people who are Americans or US persons who are interested in doing in Afghanistan will also find aspects of this presentation important. Next slide, please. So here are some of the key considerations that I'm going to look at. We'll talk a little bit about what you need to look at before you commit to invest in Afghanistan, some deal structuring issues, some deal documents, ongoing compliance issues, departure, exit from Afghanistan, and proposed bilateral investment treaty, which is something that Jeff and I have been talking about and working on a little bit. Next slide, please. So here are some key considerations before you even decide to invest in Afghanistan. The fundamental questions are, is it right for you? Does this deal or this transaction or investment opportunity, does it meet your overall investment strategy and goals? And there are a few things that you need to look at. In particular, I think the timeline issue is critical. So what is your time horizon that you're looking at to invest in Afghanistan? Is it for a period of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What is it? And what is your exit option? Those are the two very, very important key elements of deciding to invest or not. One of the major challenges that has existed so far, and I know that some of the government in Afghanistan is currently looking into this, is that there's not a whole lot of opportunities to actually exit investments in Afghanistan. There's no market, there's no public offering market in this. The possibility of finding strategic buyers for investments is somewhat difficult. So that's why you have to keep in mind the time horizon issue very seriously from an early stage. The second set of considerations you need to think about is actually the value, the financial aspects of it, the return on investment. And in there, Mr. Hasanyar will talk later on, is one of the key ingredients of that is tax issues that you need to look at, both US taxes and Afghanistan taxes. One of the most challenging aspects of doing work in Afghanistan or working in Afghanistan is the tax issues of Afghanistan. I know that they're working on revising the tax code, and there is a revised tax law that's currently pending before the Parliament or the Ministry of Justice. It's not very clear what the differences are, but the way things are currently, you have to be very, very careful, because the Ministry of Finance's capabilities are growing, and every day that passes by, they come up with more advanced interpretations of the tax rules, and those tend to impact the financials. One of the big questions that I've always had is, what is the effective tax rate in Afghanistan when you invest? And I think that that's something that maybe Mr. Hasanyar can shed a light on. Insurance is another key component that you need to look at before you decide. And of course, these days, if you're a US person doing transactions overseas, there's all sorts of KYC, know your customer or know your client requirements that you have to deal with before you jump into any transaction. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about deal structuring. The environment in doing transactions in Afghanistan is significantly different from doing transactions in the US, because you don't have the advanced rules that we have here. In terms of choice of entity and a lot of other areas, there are limited options that you have, so that's why it becomes very important to look very clearly into how you do the deal, whether it's debt, whether it's equity, what is your choice of entity? Are you going to invest as a foreign investor, or are you going to invest as a local investor? Are you going to invest through offshore entities? Currently, those options are very limited. I know that, again, they're working on revising the laws to create more opportunities and to create more options for investors, but those are some of the things that we have yet to see. There are currently no tax-free zones in Afghanistan. One of the considerations that they're looking into is to create actually tax-free economic zones, but they do not exist so far. So anyone that goes and invests in Afghanistan, you have to fully comply with all the tax law requirements in Afghanistan. Real estate issues are very, very important when you're investing in Afghanistan. Over the last 10, 12 years, I've had to deal with multiple disputes and other problems arising out of real estate issues tied to transactions. And part of that has to do with the fact that Afghanistan still does not allow foreign nationals to own real property. So again, these are things that are under consideration, but as of this date, you do have to deal with those restrictions. Most of the time, problems arise when somebody goes and invests in a real estate project and the title of the real estate is held by somebody locally, and then all sorts of issues could arise from that. So that's why it's very important that you take a close look at what the real estate component of a transaction is and how to deal with that. And of course, the last issue, again, has to do with know your customer. And this becomes important again and again when you're dealing with compliance-related issues. Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about some of the deal documents and why it's important. So most of the documents that you're going to put together when you're doing a transaction or investment or a contract in Afghanistan is either with the government or it's with the local partners that you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with the government, the documents are generally similar to those that are drafted in the US, if you're doing something in the US or a lot of other countries. But there are certain key elements. And of course, these documents are mostly drafted by US lawyers from big law firms, either here in DC or in New York. But there are some key elements that you have to take into consideration when you're actually doing deals for deals in Afghanistan. One of them is, what are some of the protections that you need from the government? So you have to think about that from the get-go and make sure that those are contained in the documents. What are some of the protections, guarantees that you want, security that you want from the government of Afghanistan? What are some of the escape clauses? Those are some of the things that you have to look at from the beginning. Other category of issues that you have to make sure that are covered in the documents are licenses and permits. It's very, very complicated. If you invest in something and you don't have the license to do it, and down the road the government does not help you with those licenses, it's important that you address those earlier on. Another set of issues that people have had to encounter with is you set up a factory and then you bring in components from a country and then you're not allowed to bring those into the country because of some restriction or licensing issues. So that's why it's very, very important that you take care of those earlier on. Incentives. What are the incentives that you need from the government? Customs exemptions are a major part of the incentives when you're investing in large projects, and I think it's something that has to be negotiated from earlier on. You need to make sure that you have those. If there are tax issues that you need to cover in your agreements, you need to make sure that those are taken care of. And then last, your risk mitigation strategies and risk mitigation rules. What happens if you get into a dispute with the government? What happens? Where do you resolve that? How do you resolve that? Those are some of the very, very important elements of your deal documents. And then when you're putting together the documents with your local partners, whether they're the suppliers, whether they're local partners, whether they're your subcontractors, there are a key set of considerations that need to go into those to make sure that you're protected both in the short term and in the long term. What are some of them? Meeting of the minds. I've had to deal with multiple unfortunate disputes over the years that arose between partners, US partners and local partners, that arose out of agreements that were never properly discussed, never properly studied, and they were signed by both parties without knowing what they were actually signing. And then later on they realized that they signed something that they did not mean to sign. So that's why it's important that both sides understand, and if you need to translate the documents, and if you need to hire a local lawyer to make sure that your local partner fully understands the terms of the agreement he's signing, so be it. But it's critical that that's something that's taken care of from the get-go. Control issues, management, banking, financial control over the transaction, over the company, over the project. Those are key considerations that have to be thought about from earlier on. And then again, risk mitigation, risk management. What happens if you run into issues? How do you resolve those issues? Are very, very important. Last but not least, recourse is a very important matter. There are a number of disputes over the years that have arisen between Afghan parties and US parties that have remained unresolved because the Afghan side cannot come to the US and is not willing to come to the US to address them, and the US side cannot go to Afghanistan. And those disputes tend to stay on for years and years, and everybody loses. Next slide, please. Once you go past the transaction, you actually execute the transaction, then there are ongoing compliance requirements that you need to abide by as US persons. Those are very, very important for both US investors in Afghanistan and also for a lot of Afghan-Americans that have now come to the US under SIV arrangements and others who are going back and forth to Afghanistan and want to make investments in Afghanistan or have businesses that they're operating in Afghanistan. So what are some of the key US laws that you have to always be mindful about? Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, number one, always. This is something that's becoming more and more serious. DOJ is looking at it more closely now than they did before. OFAC issues are absolutely critical when it comes to Afghanistan. If you don't know what OFAC is, the Office of Foreign Asset Control is part of the Treasury Department. They're the ones that impose sanctions and all sorts of, they have lists of who you can do business with and who you cannot do business with. It's very important that you do the due diligence when you do transactions in Afghanistan to make sure that that you do not do it with people that are covered or specially designated nationals as listed on OFAC lists. Export control, denied persons issues are something that are very, very critical. There is an obligation when you're exporting products into Afghanistan, who that goes to ultimately. The issue of re-export is going to become more and more important as compliance regimes become more strict. And then last but not least, reporting obligations. For every US person that does anything in Afghanistan, there's a series of reporting requirements that you have to comply with on an ongoing basis. The most well-known ones that are very serious these days are FBAR and FATCA. For those of you, again, that may not be familiar with these abbreviations, FBAR is the Foreign Bank Account Regulations that requires US persons to report all bank accounts over which they have signing authority or into which they have a financial interest. And FATCA is the Financial Accounts Tax Compliance, the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, which is another law that requires reporting from, for tax purposes for all bank accounts held by US person overseas. And then in addition to this, there are local issues that you have to, local laws that you have to take into consideration. As a US person. Those include tax law, but also a lot of other laws that are important. Next slide, please. Let me briefly talk about exit. And as I mentioned on the first slide, exit is something that as an investor, as a counsel to an investor, when you make an investment, one of the first things you think about is how do you get out of there? And I think when you talk about Afghanistan, it's also important from day one to take into account what the requirements of exiting an investment is in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, there are some limitations these days as to what the options are. But that said, in terms of timeline and dissolution objectives and sort of closing the loop on various issues that affect you, it's very important that you plan that from in advance. First of all, timeline. The process of dissolving a company and actually exiting Afghanistan is significantly slower than actually setting it up, unfortunately. And this is hopefully that they will address that as part of the new tax laws and some of these new laws that they're enacting. At the moment, it takes maybe a year, sometimes up to 2 years to close a business in Afghanistan. Dissolution objectives, you need to completely process whatever it is that you're doing to close down businesses. You can't abandon things. Unlike in the US, you can abandon an entity and it will become an abandoned entity and nobody will care after the statute of limitation expires. In Afghanistan, the issues are a little bit different. One, statute of limitation is 15 years, not 3 years or 5 years, which is what we have. So these liabilities tend to drag on. Two, if you've actually abandoned an entity, there's a risk, serious risk of personal liability against officers and board members and shareholders. So you have to be mindful of that when you're investing. You got to close the loop on some of these issues. Lastly, all the third parties that you have dealings with, whether it's employees or subcontractors, you need to make sure that you close the loop on all of those deals because they tend to drag on. And if you don't do that, then they could become issues down the road even after you've thought that you've moved on. Last slide, please. Let me briefly talk about the U.S.-Afghanistan bilateral investment treaty. There is no bilateral investment treaty, and in fact, the purpose of this slide is to say that there is a need for it, and a proposed version that some of the folks, some of the colleagues on the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce are working on. We hope that this will be brought to the attention, and Jeff can contribute to that later on, of both governments down the road, hopefully in the near future. The objective of this treaty, the principal objective would be to circumvent some of these issues that we have, to give some protections and special incentives to U.S. investors who are willing to invest in Afghanistan. Is that possible? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've gone through this checklist. There are a lot of these issues that you face as a foreign investor in Afghanistan that you could circumvent if there was actually a very good bilateral investment treaty in place between the two countries. Whether it's compliance issues or whether it's some of these reporting requirements or whether it was just the general bureaucracy of having to prepare authenticated documents or closing businesses, etc. But also substantively more on issues of taxes and other tax credits and other things that could be contained in there. So hopefully in the near future we will have a draft investment treaty that could be proposed, and hopefully down the road we'll have a bilateral investment treaty that will allow U.S. investors to go into Afghanistan and avoid some of the risks and some of the issues that are generally there without having to fully comply with the local requirements. That brings my presentation to an end. I hope I did it in the right time allotted. Thank you very much, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Inayat, and maybe we can quickly turn over to Naeem for a walk over how to navigate the taxing, reporting, and environment in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I would like to give a very high-level overview of Afghanistan income tax and compliance matters. At Emerging Consulting, we advise businesses on accounting, payroll administrations, Afghanistan tax compliance, as well as some financial-related matters. I would like to start with a very summary of some common income taxes in Afghanistan. The first one is the business receipt tax, BRT. This is the fixed tax rate on the gross revenue of all businesses, and this is paid quarterly. This tax is payable even if the businesses does not make any profit, because this tax is simply applied on the gross income that the business make. And the tax rates are different for certain industries. For example, the airline and telecommunication industries pays 10% BRT. The hotels pays 5%, and all other industries pays only 4%. The other common tax in Afghanistan is the annual income profit tax. There is a flat 20% profit tax paid at the end of the year when you make a profit. And the third one, which might not be very common to you, is the dividend tax. In addition to the BRT that is paid on the gross revenue and the annual profit tax, 20%, businesses will also be paying a 20% dividend tax when they make dividends to their shareholders and withhold that and pay it to the government. There are some other withholding taxes, such as wages, rentals, and contractors. These are not taxed on the business, but businesses are required by the tax law to withhold those taxes from its employees, vendors, and contractors and pay to the government. If in case they do not, then they will be subject to penalty as the law requires. In this chart, I would like to illustrate what is the effective marginal tax rates in Afghanistan. According to the World Bank report, they have estimated the effective tax rates to be around 48% in Afghanistan. And when they're comparing that to some of the neighboring countries and regional countries like Central Asian and South Asian, which the effective tax rate is only between 11% and 33%. And this one is if you look at the very first row, the BRT tax, that 48% tax is true for industries who pay only 4% BRT tax. But like some industries, like the airlines and the telecommunications, who are subject to a higher BRT, like 10%, if you look at the very bottom of the page on the right, they could be paying as high as 78% of their profit in taxes, which comprise the effective marginal tax rate. Of course, the World Bank made some assumptions, which are that the net profit margin for a business would be around 20%, and 50% of that they will probably be withdrawing and paying as a dividend. That was the assumption the World Bank used. If you were here, some of you were here yesterday when Mr. Bayat, in his speech, he mentioned that he is the largest taxpayer in Afghanistan. I think it's because his telecom business is subject to a very high BRT, like 10%. These are the tax rates, the marginal tax rate, 48, 53, up to 78%, if you do not have any exemptions from the Afghanistan government, or any other exemption does not apply to you. I also wanted to mention some examples of the current tax exemptions for U.S. government projects and contracts in Afghanistan. Of course, as Mr. Qasimi mentioned, there is no tax treaty between the U.S. and the Afghanistan government. However, there are a number of individual agreements between the two government and their agencies which provide some tax exemptions for their contracts and businesses. The bilateral security agreements, the BSA, signed in 2015, that provides tax exemption for DoD contractors and subcontractors. USAID has its own agreements, the Strategic Objective Agreement, SWAC, which provides tax exemptions to their partners implementing for USAID in Afghanistan. Similarly, the Department of State's INL, they have a separate agreement similar to USAID and DoD. Since 2012, there are some consistency and understanding of what tax are exempt and what tax are payable and who are exempt from taxes. This consistency and understanding is also on the side of the Ministry of Finance, the different U.S. government agencies and the contractors and businesses that work for them. But before that, there were some confusions on those taxes. So now it is consistent that these tax exemptions are primarily available to US-based companies and foreign companies. They excluded the Afghan entities and Afghan nationals from these tax exemptions in general. There might be some exceptions. On our next slides, I wanted to highlight some key operational challenges and their impacts on the business when operating in Afghanistan. This could be administrative challenges because the Afghanistan tax system and process is still very manual. All the tax forms must need to be completed by hand. So that's an administrative burden on the part of the taxpayers. And also the Afghan government and the Ministry of Finance, they use a different calendar than most of the international companies they use. So that would result in not being able to file and report their taxes on time, because there are a few days, like 10 days, lost when they convert the two calendars. In addition, there are some challenges in interpretation of the tax law. The tax law is when it is written, it's more applicable to local businesses, but when it comes to international and foreign businesses, there are key areas that does not address. For example, the international companies, if they have head office outside Afghanistan and they would like to include a portion of those costs into their expenses, the Ministry of Finance and the Afghan Revenue departments may not agree to some of those costs. So there will always be some challenges and disputes between the taxpayers and the tax office. As a result of these issues, there will be some high tax penalties. There is penalty for not paying their tax on time and not filing on time, and those penalty over time would accumulate and will result in a very high potential penalty cost exposure. The other impacts this issue will have is on the business side. If you do not have your taxes up to date, you will not receive the tax clearance letter from the different tax offices, and that will result that you will not be able to renew your business license, renew your visa, and you will not be able to bid on government contracts, and you will also not be able to even close your business if you don't have an activity. And more serious would be that there will be some legal consequences, such as that you will not be able to leave the country, especially if your name is on the business license. Those are some challenges if tax are not properly complied in Afghanistan. I also wanted, this is the last slide, I also wanted to mention some recent development in tax, and there are some good news. The Ministry of Finance has recently announced in January 2018 that they will waive 95% of the tax penalties of those businesses who owe tax to the Ministry of Finance for years and they're not able to clear their taxes. And this covers the year from 2002 until 2017. And this program is on, these procedures, and any businesses could take this opportunity until October 2018. There's also a tax working group which includes representative from the Ministry of Finance, DOD, and U.S. Embassy, that on a continuous basis they are working with each other to tackle some of these challenges that they have in taxes. And recently they had a meeting and they agreed that DOD contractors would not be required to provide a full copy of their contract when they're applying for tax exemptions or filing their taxes. And one more recent upgrade or development in the Afghanistan Revenue Department is that they will allow electronic use of electronic tax forms. They will start with the large taxpayers and then roll over that programs to the rest of taxpayers. And finally, as a certified public accountant and tax professionals, I would like to suggest you all as a business owner or a business manager that it's better that you have some general understanding of the Afghanistan income tax law. The tax law itself is only 49 pages, and I think anyone can read that in a matter of a few hours, or even you can plan to read that on your next flight to Kabul. However, the tax manual is over 300 pages, which provide more guidelines, but we can provide you a two-page summary that will help you understand the tax law, some common taxes, if you are not willing to read those tax law documents. And finally, if there are tax issues that you will not be able to, more complex tax issues that you will not be able to resolve on yourself with the tax office, we definitely recommend you work with a tax accountant and tax attorneys. There are more tax service providers in Afghanistan than ever before. So there is a good capacity that are being that companies, local companies that are helping with tax. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. Naeem, I just want to let you know that the reason that there's so many accountants is that capitalism has arrived, okay, in Afghanistan. Dan, can we do a couple audience questions? Howie Lin from International Stability Operations Association would like to start.
Sure.
And we'll let some of our guests maybe ask, and then feel free to jump in on anything you want to follow up on,
and
too.
I know we're bumping up against the next panel, so maybe when you think we're at the end, we can step down.
Great, thank you. I'm Howie Lind, and thank you very much for your presentations. I'm going to be on the next panel talking about similar things with taxes, but just a couple points that you brought up for both gentlemen there. There is tax exemptions is a huge issue still with a lot of companies that U.S. government companies over there. One of the major sticking points, you kind of mentioned it. I forget which lecture, but talked about the licensing. So the decoupling. So let's say a company XYZ has a tax issue. Decoupling that from their business license renewal, because if sometimes some companies their business license comes up for renewal and it's not renewed because of this tax issue, right? So therefore they can't work, so they're stuck, and so it's that's a big issue with companies. So let me just leave it at that and see how you respond. Thank you, sir.
I'll take. Does this work, or I guess it works? Okay.
It's automatic.
Let me answer that. I think what you're talking about is in a very narrow context of contractors that are trying to manage compliance versus license renewal issue. What I talked about was more broadly about licensing and permits in general. So if you're actually investing in Afghanistan, whether it's an energy project or a mining project or an airport project or whatever that may be, and you enter into a public-private partnership arrangement or something else with the government of Afghanistan, as part of the agreement, the underlying agreements that you sign with the government, you can include a lot of these things in there. So that's why I think the idea there was that you should know what licenses and permits you need before you conclude a transaction, and you got to make sure that those are covered in your contracts. With respect to the issue of contractors, which is what ISOA is concerned with, I think that issue has kind of generally been resolved. The requirement is if you meet your basic tax law requirements, you should be able to renew your license. The problem is if you owe taxes, then paying that is part of the basic tax requirement. So you got to make sure that that a lot of contractors that have issues that they've not met the basic requirements, and that's why their licenses are held back or they're not issued. I think that for a lot of U.S. contractors, especially under BSA, it should not be too difficult to get your licenses done if they do the basic stuff.
All right, I want to, unless I see a hand, I'm going to jump in and, there we go, Assad's got one, all right.
Yeah, Mr. Hassanior and Mr. Qasimi, outstanding presentation. Mr. Hassanior, according to BSA, are there differences when it comes to the exemption between the DoD and State Department and also USAID, or they're both, are they all the same?
Can you repeat the question? Yeah, I couldn't.
Yeah, the question was that according to the BSA, the bilateral security agreements, are the tax exemptions different for DoD, Department of State, or USAID?
Correct.
Well, the BSA part only covers tax exemptions for DoD contractors and military agencies in Afghanistan. That's why the USAID has its own agreement, the Strategic Objective Agreement SWAGs, that they provide tax exemptions for its contract. And similarly, Department of State, INL is representing projects, implementing projects on behalf of Department of States. They have a different separate agreements. The embassy does not have any agreements because they don't implement any development projects. So the tax exemptions, as I mentioned, after 2012, the language and the requirements are very consistent in all three of these agreements, but the process and procedures to get those exemptions are very different. It depends on from one agency to a different agency. But in general, all of those will provide tax exemptions to U.S. based companies or international companies who work for those agencies.
Let me add one point to that. One of the big problems that some contractors have had is they were under the assumption that State Department had exemptions. The State Department, the embassy's presence is governed by Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. In there, it is specifically, they have excluded contractor eligibility for taxes. So contractors that provide services to the embassy are not eligible for exemption. They have to pay taxes under the local laws if a local company does. That's one thing. Another thing is, I agree with Ms. Hassanyar that BSA is exclusive to DOD, but there's also one with NATO that covers other countries that are not US DOD, everything from the UK to all the NATO partners that are operating in Afghanistan, which is identical to the BSA one.
Dan, I'm like a dog with a bone on this, so bear with me.
Sure.
The bilateral investment agreement, the State Department has a small role in that. USAID has a small supporting role, but it's really, Treasury Department has authority for negotiating bilateral investment agreements, but frankly, the Treasury Department doesn't care about Afghanistan. So it's a process of getting a bilateral investment agreement done. It takes time, and it takes a coalition of interested parties. The first party that the Treasury Department asks that you have with them is, do you have the American business community asking for it? Because we haven't gotten any calls from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about it. We're an American Afghan chamber, but we have a large coalition of interested parties, and especially multinationals that work in the region that would be interested eventually in investing in Afghanistan, maybe some of them very soon, including Siemens, who's selling a product in on the buyout deal. So how can we work with state and USAID and a coalition of the willing, I guess, to help pressure for a U.S. role? Because I know the Afghans would consider negotiating on this, but they don't see any U.S. interest in it yet. And I think we also hear from the USTR that they feel that the WTO accession is their main focus right now, that loading that negotiation on would be too much for the capacity right now of the institutions in Kabul. But it's a slow process, and we have to start sometime. What is your view? And I'd love Eniat's opinion, too, on this, if you could.
Yeah, I think you kind of you hit on some of the things that are aspects of the priority for this. I think you're right. I think the focus has been on other things, whether it's implementing our development assistance programs, or I think earlier in the two-day session you've talked about the extractive industry. All of those things have just had a higher priority over the last 15, 16 years that we've been focused on economic development in Afghanistan. So I think it's an option that we can look at. I think you hit the nail on the head that the constituencies involved have to build, and I think if you continue to do that, the State Department's going to be all ears. It just hasn't come up as a huge priority yet, but it's something we do all around the world, and I think if there's a coalescing of interest, then it's something we'll have to pay attention to. Short answer.
I think that if you go through the normal sort of bureaucratic process, this could take a long time to come to fruition. In my view, the best way of advancing this objective is to actually tie it to other key policy considerations. Security, our objective to make sure that Afghanistan becomes self-sufficient. Looking at it from the Afghan perspective, I think that the Afghan government wants to be able to receive long-term support from the U.S. government. And a key way of achieving that is to keep U.S. businesses interested in Afghanistan. And the way to do that is to give them special incentives and special privileges. And I think if you put the agreement, the draft agreement to the Afghan side, I'm sure that they will realize how important it is and they will advance it as their agenda as well. So this has to be worked through a multi-pronged strategy, not just the traditional one.
So you think that that's something that AACC should continue focusing on in the new year, or is this something that we should maybe rethink a strategy on? What is your opinion?
Well, I think we've started taken the initiative to put together a rough draft for somebody, and that's good because we probably have some technical capacity that others may not have that. So that's a good step to take forward. And then once we present it, I mean, I think beyond that, that's outside of the scope of AACC's mandate, and I don't know, that's something that you're more familiar with, whether we can do that or not within the rules. But, all the members of the AACC could try to work together to advance that in one way or another. And I think that this is something that has to be, the importance of it has to be emphasized to the Afghan side and to the U.S. side.
Totally
as
agree.
something that really, really complements ultimate security strategy and everything else that we're
Self-sustainability, I agree. I want to thank you guys. That was an awesome panel. Really enjoyed it. Your presentations were first rate. We will share these presentations with our much wider audience as well, as you know, and you're now part of our video, which will be shared by an even wider audience. So thank you very much.
Good job.
We're going to ask now that our next panel and our final panel commence on security, both for national security in Afghanistan updates and investments in project security. Doug Brooks is our moderator and an AACC board member and executive committee member, and he'll be joined by Mark DeWitt from Garda World and Howie Lin, the president of the International Stability Operations Association.